The rain hammered against the Moonlight Cafe windows like bullets, but Isabella Martinez barely noticed as she watched the small figure huddled against the building across the street. The little boy couldn't have been more than 6, his expensive clothes soaked through, his tiny shoulders shaking with sobs that she could see even from her position behind the counter. Isabella. Table 7 is still waiting for their order. Vincent's sharp voice cut through her concern. Her manager's tone carried the familiar edge of irritation that had become her constant companion during the evening shifts. She glanced at the clock, 9:47 p.m. Her shift ended in 13 minutes, but that child had been out there for almost an hour. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to help, even though leaving her post could cost her the job she desperately needed to pay for her nursing school and her grandmother's medications. The boy stumbled, nearly falling to the wet pavement, and Isabella's heart clenched. Without another thought, she untied her apron and headed for the door. "Where are you going, Isabella? Don't you dare walk out that door!" She didn't look back. Some things mattered more than paychecks. What Isabella didn't know was that across Portland, the most feared man in the Korean underworld was tearing the streets apart, looking for that same little boy. And when Jae-wook Kim finally found his son, he would also discover the woman who had risked everything to keep him safe, a woman who would change everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and what it meant to protect someone with your life. Isabella Martinez had learned long ago that survival meant keeping your head down and working twice as hard as everyone else. At 27, she'd perfected the art of being efficient and invisible, a skill that served her well in the upscale Moonlight Cafe in downtown Portland, where she worked the evening shift to pay for nursing school and her grandmother Dorothy's mounting medical bills. "Table 12 wants another cappuccino," her co-worker Sarah whispered as she passed by with a tray of pastries, "and they're getting impatient." Isabella nodded, grabbing the coffee pot with practiced ease. The evening crowd was particularly demanding tonight. Wealthy tech executives and their wives who treated the cafe staff like furniture. She'd grown accustomed to their dismissive glances and condescending tones, focusing instead on the tips that would help cover Dorothy's insulin this month. "Martinez," Vincent's voice boomed across the cafe, causing several customers to look up from their laptops. "Table 9 is complaining about cold coffee, again." Heat flushed Isabella's cheeks as she hurried to remedy the situation. Vincent had been looking for reasons to write her up ever since she'd started taking evening classes at Portland Community College. He'd made it clear that he preferred employees who were fully committed to the cafe, not ones with divided attention. The storm outside had been building all evening, and now rain lashed against the large windows that faced Morrison Street. Portland was used to rain, but this was different, violent and unrelenting, the kind of weather that kept most people indoors. That's why the small figure across the street caught her attention. Isabella first noticed him around 8:30, a little boy in what looked like expensive clothes, standing alone under the inadequate shelter of a bus stop. She'd assumed someone was coming for him, but as the minutes ticked by and the rain intensified, her concern grew. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with delicate Asian features and perfectly styled black hair that was now plastered to his head. His clothes, a designer jacket and what looked like private school uniform pants, were completely soaked through. But it was his posture that broke her heart. Small shoulders hunched against the storm, tiny hands pressed to his face as his body shook with what she could only assume were sobs. "Isabella," Vincent's sharp tone made her jump. "Stop staring out the window and focus on your job. Table 7 has been waiting 10 minutes for their check." She forced herself to turn away from the window, but the image of the crying child burned in her mind. As she processed payments and cleared tables, she kept glancing outside, hoping to see an adult approaching the boy. Instead, she watched him grow smaller and more miserable with each passing minute. By 9:30, Isabella couldn't stand it anymore. The child had been out there for over an hour, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Where were his parents? Why wasn't anyone helping him? She approached Vincent during a brief lull in customers. "There's a little boy outside who's been alone for over an hour. I think he might be lost." Vincent barely looked up from the register, Not our problem, we're not running a daycare center. But he's just a child, and it's pouring. And we're running a business, Vincent cut her off. Your job is to serve customers, not play Good Samaritan to every stray kid in Portland. Get back to work. Isabella bit back her response, but her eyes drifted to the window again. The little boy had slumped against the bus stop wall, his small frame shaking violently. Whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion, she couldn't tell. At 9:45, as she was wiping down tables for the third time, she heard it. A sound that cut through the storm and the cafe's ambient noise. The child was crying loudly enough that she could hear him through the rain and glass. That's when she saw him stumble, his little legs giving out as he nearly collapsed onto the wet sidewalk. Isabella's decision was instant and absolute. She untied her apron, grabbed her jacket from behind the counter and headed for the door. Where do you think you're going? Vincent's voice followed her across the cafe. There's a child out there who needs help, she said without turning around. If you walk out that door, you're fired. Do you hear me, Martinez? Fired. Isabella's hand paused on the door handle. She needed this job desperately. Dorothy's medications alone cost $300 a month, and nursing school wasn't cheap. But as another sob reached her through the storm, her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Mija, when you see someone who needs help, and you have the power to give it, you help. That's what makes us human. She pushed open the door and stepped into the storm. The rain hit her like a physical blow, immediately soaking through her jacket and uniform. The wind whipped her long black hair across her face as she ran across the empty street, her heart pounding with more than just exertion. Hey, sweetie, she called out as she approached the bus stop, trying to make her voice gentle despite having to shout over the storm. Are you okay? The little boy looked up at her with wide, dark eyes filled with tears and terror. He said something in what sounded like Korean, his voice barely audible over the rain. Isabella knelt down to his level, not caring that the cold water immediately soaked through her pants. It's okay, baby. You're safe now. I'm going to help you. She didn't speak Korean, but fear and distress were universal languages. The child was trembling violently, his lips tinged blue with cold. Without hesitation, Isabella shrugged out of her jacket and wrapped it around his small shoulders, then gathered him into her arms. Shh, it's okay, she murmured, holding him close as he buried his face against her shoulder. We're going to get you warm and find your family. As she stood, cradling the child against her chest, Isabella felt a presence behind her. She turned slowly, still holding the boy, and found herself face to face with a tall figure emerging from the shadows between two parked cars. The man was imposing even in the storm, easily 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders beneath an expensive black coat that somehow remained pristine despite the rain. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his face. Isabella's breath caught. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp cheekbones and intense dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her. But it was the expression on his face that made her step back instinctively. Relief, yes, but also something darker, something dangerous. Taemin, the man said, his voice carrying easily over the storm despite its quiet tone. The little boy in Isabella's arms lifted his head and let out a cry that was pure joy and relief. Appa! Isabella's arms loosened automatically as the child reached for the man, but she found herself reluctant to let go. Something about the stranger's presence set her on edge, even as she recognized the obvious love between father and son. Thank you, the man said, his English accented but precise. His dark eyes fixed on Isabella's face with an intensity that made her shiver. You saved my son. He was alone in the storm, Isabella managed, suddenly aware of how she must look, soaked to the skin, her uniform clinging to her body, her hair a mess. I couldn't just leave him. The man stepped closer, and Isabella caught a scent that seemed impossible in the rain, expensive cologne and something else, something that spoke of power and danger. Most people would have. I'm not most people, she replied, then immediately wondered why she'd said something so bold to a complete stranger. A smile ghosted across the man's lips, transforming his face from merely handsome to absolutely breathtaking. "No," he said quietly. "I can see that you're not." Jae-wook Kim had built his reputation on control. Control over his emotions, his organization, and every situation he encountered. In the 15 years since he'd inherited leadership of the most powerful Korean syndicate on the West Coast, he'd never once lost his composure in public. Tonight had shattered that record completely. When his son's babysitter had called in hysterics, claiming Tae-min had disappeared during their walk to the bookstore, Jae-wook had felt something he hadn't experienced since his wife's death. Pure, paralyzing fear. He'd mobilized every resource at his disposal. 30 men combing the streets, contacts in the police department, even traffic camera feeds, all to find one small boy who meant more to him than his entire empire. And now watching this stranger, this woman who had risked her own safety to protect his child, Jae-wook felt something else he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine gratitude mixed with an attraction so immediate and powerful it nearly knocked him off balance. "What's your name?" he asked, shifting Tae-min to one arm while keeping his eyes fixed on the woman before him. "Isabella," she replied, wrapping her arms around herself as the rain continued to soak through her clothes. "Isabella Martinez." "Isabella," he repeated, liking the way her name felt on his tongue. "I'm Jae-wook Kim, and this is my son Tae-min." The little boy had stopped crying but remained pressed against his father's chest, occasionally peeking at Isabella with shy curiosity. She smiled at him, and Jae-wook felt his chest tighten at the genuine warmth in her expression. "How long was he out here?" Jae-wook asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage building inside him. Someone would pay for this negligence, the babysitter who had panicked and run, leaving his son alone in a storm. "About an hour," Isabella replied, then bit her lip as if debating whether to say more. "I wanted to help sooner, but my manager—" She glanced back at the cafe where Jae-wook could see a man in a white shirt gesturing angrily through the window. "Your manager what?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended, and Isabella's eyes widened slightly. "He said it wasn't our problem," she admitted quietly. "And he fired me for leaving to help Tae-min." Jae-wook's jaw clenched. "He fired you for helping a child?" Isabella shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but he could see the worry in her dark eyes. "It's okay. I'll find something else." It wasn't okay. Nothing about this situation was okay. This woman, this beautiful, compassionate woman, had sacrificed her livelihood to help his son, and some petty manager had punished her for basic human decency. "No," Jae-wook said firmly. "It's not okay." Before Isabella could respond, he was pulling out his phone with his free hand. "Marcus," he said when his second-in-command answered on the first ring. "I need you to look into a business called Moonlight Cafe on Morrison Street. I want to know everything about the owner, the manager, their suppliers, their lease agreements, everything." "Jae-wook, you don't have to," Isabella started, but he held up a hand. "And I need a car here in 5 minutes," he continued into the phone. "The black sedan." "Boss, we found him." Marcus's relief was audible even over the storm. "Safe and sound," Jae-wook confirmed, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. "But we have some business to take care of." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his coat pocket. "You're soaked," he observed, noting how Isabella was trying unsuccessfully to stop her teeth from chattering. "And you've lost your job helping my family. The least I can do is make sure you get home safely." "That's really not necessary," Isabella protested. "I can take the bus. In this storm? Absolutely not." Jae-wook's tone brooked no argument. "My car will be here shortly." As if summoned by his words, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, its engine purring quietly despite the chaos of the storm. The driver, a man Jae-wook recognized as one of his most trusted associates, stepped out with an umbrella. "Mr. Kim," the driver said with a slight bow. "I'm glad to see young Master Tae-min is safe." "Thank you, Jinho," Jae-wook replied. Then to Isabella, "Please, let us drive you home." Isabella hesitated, and Jae-wook could practically see her internal debate. She was clearly uncomfortable accepting help from a stranger, but the practical reality of getting home in the storm was undeniable. "I live with my grandmother," she said finally. "She'll be worried if I'm much later." "Then we shouldn't keep her waiting," Jay-Wook said, gesturing toward the car. The ride through Portland's rain-slicked streets was filled with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Isabella sat beside him in the back seat, acutely aware of his presence, the way he filled the space with an almost magnetic energy, the subtle scent of his cologne, the careful way he held his son while keeping one eye on her. Taemin had fallen asleep against his father's chest, exhausted by his ordeal. In the dim light of the car's interior, Isabella could see the resemblance between father and son, the same dark eyes, the same elegant bone structure. "He's beautiful," she said softly, not wanting to wake the child. "He's everything to me," Jay-Wook replied, his voice carrying a weight that spoke of loss and fierce protection. "His mother died when he was 4. It's been just the two of us since then." Isabella felt her heart clench. "I'm sorry. That must be incredibly difficult." "We manage," Jay-Wook said, but she could hear the loneliness beneath his composed exterior. "Though nights like this remind me how vulnerable he is. How vulnerable we both are." There was something in his tone that made Isabella look at him more closely. In the passing streetlights, she caught glimpses of a man who carried heavy burdens, who had learned to be strong because he had no other choice. "Turn left here," she directed as they approached her neighborhood. The contrast between the upscale downtown area and her modest residential street was stark, but Jay-Wook made no comment about the change in surroundings. The car pulled up in front of a small, well-maintained house with a front porch light glowing warmly through the rain. Isabella could see her grandmother's silhouette in the front window. Dorothy had been watching for her, as she did every night. "Thank you," Isabella said, reaching for the door handle. "For the ride, I mean, and I'm glad Taemin is safe." "Isabella." Jay-Wook's voice stopped her before she could step out into the rain. "What you did tonight, there aren't many people who would have made that choice." She turned back to face him, struck again by the intensity of his gaze. "Any decent person would have helped a child in distress." "You'd be surprised," he said quietly. "The world isn't as kind as you seem to think it is." There was something almost sad in his words, as if he spoke from bitter experience. Isabella found herself wanting to know more about this man who inspired such devotion in his son and carried himself with such quiet authority. "Maybe not," she agreed, "but that doesn't mean we should stop trying to make it better." Jay-Wook studied her for a long moment, and Isabella felt as if he were seeing something in her that she didn't even know existed. "No," he said finally. "I suppose it doesn't." She stepped out into the rain, but before she could close the door, Jay-Wook spoke again. "Isabella, I meant what I said about your job. What happened tonight isn't over." Before she could ask what he meant, the car was pulling away, leaving her standing in the rain with more questions than answers, and the strangest feeling that her life had just taken a turn she never could have anticipated. Inside the house, Dorothy Martinez was waiting with a warm towel and worried eyes. "Mija, you're soaked. What happened? And who was that in the car?" Isabella accepted the towel gratefully, trying to process the evening's events herself. "I helped a little boy who was lost in the storm," she said simply. "His father gave me a ride home." But even as she said it, Isabella knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing about Jay-Wook Kim felt simple. There had been something in his eyes, in the way he carried himself, in the obvious wealth and the careful way his driver had treated him, that suggested depth she couldn't begin to fathom. And despite every rational thought telling her to forget about the mysterious stranger and his son, Isabella found herself hoping she would see them again. Isabella spent a restless night replaying every moment of her encounter with Jay-Wook Kim and his son. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving Portland washed clean and sparkling under weak autumn sunshine. But Isabella's problems remained unchanged. She was unemployed. Her grandmother's medication was due for refill in 3 days, and her nursing school tuition was due next week. "You did the right thing, Mija," Dorothy said over breakfast, her weathered hands steady as she poured coffee. At 73, Isabella's grandmother remained the strongest person she knew, even as diabetes slowly wore away at her health. That little boy needed help, and you gave it. The job. We'll figure something out. Isabella nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. She'd already started mentally calculating how long her savings would last and which expenses she could cut. Maybe she could pick up extra shifts at the diner where she worked weekends, or... The doorbell interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Isabella opened the front door to find a woman in an expensive navy suit standing on the porch, holding a large envelope and wearing the kind of confident smile that belonged in corporate boardrooms. "Isabella Martinez?" the woman asked. "Yes?" "My name is Sarah Chen, and I represent Kim Industries. Mr. Kim would like to offer you a position with his company." Isabella blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what? May I come in? I think you'll find our offer quite interesting." 10 minutes later, Isabella sat across from Sarah Chen at her grandmother's kitchen table, staring at a contract that seemed too good to be true. Dorothy hovered nearby, her protective instincts clearly activated by the unexpected visitor. "Personal assistant to Mr. Kim," Sarah explained, her manicured finger pointing to the job title. "The position includes a competitive salary, full health benefits, and flexible scheduling to accommodate your nursing school classes." Isabella's eyes widened as she saw the salary figure. It was more than double what she'd been making at the cafe. "This has to be a mistake." "No mistake," Sarah assured her. "Mr. Kim was very specific about the terms. He values loyalty and compassion, qualities you demonstrated last night." "But I don't have any experience as a personal assistant," Isabella protested. "I'm a waitress and a nursing student." "Mr. Kim is more interested in character than credentials," Sarah replied smoothly. "He believes the right person can learn any job." Dorothy moved closer, her sharp eyes scanning the contract. "What kind of business is Kim Industries?" "Import, export, primarily," Sarah answered without hesitation. "Mr. Kim has extensive business interests throughout the Pacific Northwest and Asia. The position would involve managing his calendar, handling correspondence, and occasionally accompanying him to business meetings." Isabella's mind raced. The offer was generous, too generous for someone with her limited qualifications. But the memory of Tai-Min's tear-stained face and Jae-wook's grateful eyes made her want to trust that this was genuine. "When would I start?" she asked. "Today, if you're willing. Mr. Kim has a busy schedule, and his previous assistant left rather suddenly." Isabella looked at her grandmother, who gave her an encouraging nod. "What do you think, Abuela?" "I think," Dorothy said carefully, "that sometimes opportunities come in unexpected packages, but trust your instincts, Mika." Isabella's instincts were telling her that Jae-wook Kim was more complicated than he appeared, but they were also telling her that he was a man of his word, and right now she needed this opportunity more than she needed answers to her questions. "I'll take it," she said. 2 hours later, Isabella stood in the lobby of a gleaming downtown office building, wearing her best interview outfit and trying not to feel overwhelmed by the obvious wealth surrounding her. Kim Industries occupied the top 3 floors of the building, and the elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt like ascending to another world. "Mr. Kim is expecting you," the receptionist said with a warm smile. "Conference room B down the hall to your right." Isabella found the conference room easily enough, but stopped short when she saw Jae-wook through the glass walls. Gone was the concerned father from the night before. In his place sat a man who radiated power and authority. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Isabella's monthly rent, and he was speaking in rapid Korean to 3 other men who hung on his every word. When he saw her, Jae-wook's expression softened slightly. He said something to the other men, who immediately gathered their papers and left the room. "Isabella," he said, standing as she entered. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the opportunity," she replied, trying to match his professional tone, despite the way her pulse quickened when he smiled. "Please sit." He gestured to the chair across from him. "I hope Sarah explained the position adequately." She did, but I have to ask, why me? You barely know me. Jae-wook leaned back in his chair, studying her with those intense dark eyes. I know enough. I know you're willing to sacrifice your own security to help a child. I know you're working multiple jobs to support your grandmother and pay for school. I know you have integrity, which is rarer than you might think in my world. What exactly is your world? Isabella asked, then immediately worried she'd overstepped. But Jae-wook didn't seem offended. I run a successful import business with connections throughout Asia. It's demanding work that requires someone I can trust completely. There was something in his tone that suggested layers beneath the simple explanation, but before Isabella could probe further, the conference room door opened. Appa! Taemin burst into the room, followed by a flustered-looking woman in her 50s. I'm so sorry, Mr. Kim, the woman said in accented English. He saw Miss Isabella through the window and insisted on saying hello. Isabella's heart melted as Taemin ran directly to her, his face bright with recognition and joy. Isabella, you're here. Hi, sweetheart, she said, kneeling to his level. How are you feeling today? Much better, Taemin replied in careful English. Mrs. Park made me soup, and Appa stayed home this morning to make sure I was okay. Isabella glanced at Jae-wook, who was watching the interaction with an expression she couldn't quite read. That was very thoughtful of your father. He was worried, Taemin confided in a stage whisper. He kept checking on me all night. Taemin, Jae-wook said gently. Isabella and I are having a business meeting. Is she going to work with us? Taemin asked hopefully. If she accepts the position, yes. Taemin turned back to Isabella with pleading eyes. Please say yes. Appa needs someone nice to help him, and you're the nicest person I know. Isabella felt her heart clench at the child's earnest expression. Well, when you put it like that, how can I refuse? Taemin's delighted laugh filled the conference room, and Isabella caught Jae-wook's slight smile before he composed his features again. Mrs. Park, he said to the older woman, please take Taemin to my office. I'll be finished here shortly. After they left, Jae-wook turned back to Isabella. He doesn't warm up to people easily. His mother's death. It made him cautious around new people. He's been through a lot for someone so young, Isabella observed. We both have, Jae-wook said quietly. Which is why I need someone I can trust, not just with my business, but with him. The position involves more than typical assistant duties. Sometimes I'll need you to help with Taemin when Mrs. Park isn't available. Isabella nodded. I'd be happy to help with him. He's a wonderful child. He is, Jae-wook agreed, and for a moment his carefully controlled mask slipped, revealing the devoted father beneath the powerful businessman. So you'll take the position? Yes, Isabella said, surprised by how certain she felt. When do I start? Now, if you're ready, I have a dinner meeting tonight with some associates from Seoul, and I'd like you to observe how these things work. As they spent the rest of the afternoon going over her duties and the company's operations, Isabella found herself increasingly intrigued by Jae-wook Kim. He was clearly intelligent and successful, but there was something else. A careful way he spoke about certain aspects of his business, a deference from his employees that went beyond normal respect, and an underlying tension that suggested his world was more complicated than import-export would typically require. But it was the way he lit up when talking about Taemin, and the genuine gratitude in his eyes when he looked at her, that made Isabella want to learn more about the man behind the powerful facade. What she didn't know was that across town, Vincent was discovering that the Moonlight Cafe's lease had been mysteriously terminated, their main supplier had cancelled their contract, and their business license was under review for unspecified violations. And in a nondescript office building, Marcus was briefing Jae-wook's security team about potential threats from rival organizations who might see the boss's new assistant as a weakness to exploit. Isabella Martinez had entered a world where kindness was rare, loyalty was everything, and love could be the most dangerous emotion of all. 3 weeks into her new position, Isabella had settled into a routine that felt almost too good to be true. Her days were split between managing Jae-wook's schedule, helping with Taemin when needed, and attending her nursing classes in the evenings. The salary was allowing her to not only cover Dorothy's medications, but also to start saving for the first time in years. What she hadn't expected was how much she would enjoy working with Jae-wook himself. Beneath his controlled exterior, she'd discovered a man with a sharp sense of humor, genuine concern for his employees, and an obvious devotion to his son that made her heart ache in the best possible way. When he smiled, really smiled, not the polite expression he wore for business associates, Isabella felt something flutter in her chest that she tried very hard to ignore. "Isabella," Jae-wook said as she entered his office that Tuesday morning, "I need you to cancel my 2 o'clock meeting and reschedule the conference call with the Tokyo office." "Of course," she replied, settling into the chair across from his desk with her tablet. "Any particular reason?" "Tae-min's school called. He's running a fever, and Mrs. Park is visiting her sister in Seattle this week." Isabella looked up from her notes. "You should go. I can handle the rescheduling and anything else that comes up." "Actually," Jae-wook said, his tone carefully casual, "I was hoping you might come with me. Tae-min has been asking for you, and he's more comfortable when you're around." The flutter in Isabella's chest intensified. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd spent several evenings at Jae-wook's house when work ran late, and she'd been amazed by the transformation in both father and son when they were in their private space. Jae-wook became more relaxed, more openly affectionate with Tae-min, and the little boy bloomed under the attention of both adults. "I'd be happy to help," Isabella said, trying to keep her voice professional despite the warmth spreading through her chest. Jae-wook's house was a stunning modern structure in the hills overlooking Portland, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city below. But what struck Isabella most was how it managed to feel like a home rather than a showpiece, with Tae-min's artwork on the refrigerator and family photos scattered throughout the living spaces. They found Tae-min curled up on the couch in the family room, looking small and miserable under a pile of blankets. His face brightened when he saw Isabella. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse from his fever. "Of course I came," Isabella replied, settling beside him on the couch. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "My throat hurts, and I'm cold," Tae-min admitted, snuggling closer to her side. Isabella placed her hand on his forehead, frowning at the heat she felt there. "Jae-wook, has he taken anything for the fever?" "Children's Tylenol about an hour ago," Jae-wook replied, hovering nearby with the uncertain expression of a man accustomed to solving problems with authority rather than nurturing. "Let me make him some tea with honey," Isabella suggested, "and maybe some soup? Sometimes comfort food helps as much as medicine." As Isabella moved around the kitchen, preparing remedies she'd learned from Dorothy during her own childhood illnesses, she was acutely aware of Jae-wook watching her every move. When she glanced up from the stove, she found him leaning against the counter with an expression that made her breath catch. "What?" she asked softly. "Nothing," he said, but his eyes remained fixed on her face. "It's just, he hasn't had anyone take care of him like this since his mother died." The raw emotion in his voice made Isabella's chest tighten. "He's easy to care about. So are you," Jae-wook said quietly, and suddenly the kitchen felt much smaller. Before Isabella could respond, Tae-min called from the living room, breaking the moment. But as they spent the afternoon caring for the sick little boy, taking turns reading to him, monitoring his fever, and simply being present, Isabella felt something shift between her and Jae-wook. The careful professional boundaries they'd maintained were dissolving, replaced by something deeper and more dangerous. It was nearly evening when Tae-min finally fell into a peaceful sleep, his fever broken and his breathing easy. Isabella and Jae-wook sat in the kitchen, sharing a quiet dinner, while keeping one ear tuned for any sounds from the living room. "Thank you," Jae-wook said suddenly. "For today, for everything. I don't think I realized how much we both needed." This, Isabella asked, though she thought she knew what he meant. "Family," he said simply. The feeling of not being alone, Isabella's heart clenched at the loneliness in his voice. "You're not alone. You have Tae-min and people who care about you." "People who work for me," Jae-wook corrected, People who depend on me. It's not the same thing. What about friends? Family? Jae-wook's expression grew guarded. My work doesn't leave much room for personal relationships, and after my wife died, it seemed easier to focus on Taemin and the business. Isabella wanted to ask more about his work, about the careful way he spoke about certain aspects of his life, but something in his tone warned her off. Instead, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. You don't have to be alone, she said softly. Jae-wook's eyes fixed on their joined hands, and Isabella felt the tension radiating from him. Isabella, he said, his voice rough, you don't understand what you're saying. Then explain it to me. For a moment, she thought he might. His dark eyes searched her face, as if looking for something, and Isabella held her breath, sensing they were on the edge of something that would change everything between them. But before Jae-wook could speak, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. Isabella watched his expression change as he read it, the warmth in his eyes replaced by something cold and dangerous. I have to go, he said, already standing. There's a situation that requires my immediate attention. What kind of situation? Isabella asked, alarmed by the sudden transformation in his demeanor. Business, Jae-wook replied curtly. But Isabella caught the way his hand moved instinctively to his jacket, as if checking for something hidden there. I need you to stay with Taemin until Mrs. Park returns tomorrow. Of course. But Jae-wook... Don't leave the house, he interrupted, his tone sharp with authority. Don't answer the door for anyone you don't know. And if anything seems wrong, call this number immediately. He handed her a card with a phone number written in his precise handwriting. Isabella stared at it, her mind racing with questions and a growing sense of unease. Jae-wook, you're scaring me. What's going on? For a moment his mask slipped, and she saw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her and Taemin. I can't explain right now, but I promise I'll tell you everything when I get back. Just please be careful. He kissed the top of Taemin's head gently, then turned back to Isabella. For a heartbeat she thought he might kiss her too, but instead he cupped her face in his hands. You mean more to me than you know, he said quietly. Both of you do. And then he was gone, leaving Isabella alone with a sleeping child and the growing certainty that Jae-wook Kim was hiding something much more dangerous than import-export business. Outside, 3 black SUVs were pulling up to a warehouse on the outskirts of Portland, where members of the Tanaka clan had made the mistake of threatening Kim territory. And in his car, Jae-wook was checking his weapon while trying to push away the image of Isabella's trusting face. He'd known this moment would come, when his two worlds would collide, and he'd have to choose between protecting the woman he was falling in love with and maintaining the empire that had defined his life. What he didn't know was that Isabella Martinez was stronger than he imagined, and that love could be the most powerful weapon of all. Isabella barely slept that night, jumping at every sound and checking on Taemin every hour. When Jae-wook finally returned at dawn, she was waiting in the kitchen with coffee and a dozen questions. He looked exhausted, his usually perfect appearance disheveled, and there was something in his eyes that made Isabella's stomach clench with worry. Is everything okay? She asked as he sank into a chair across from her. For now, he replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. How's Taemin? His fever broke around midnight. He's sleeping peacefully. Isabella studied his face, noting the tension in his jaw and the way he avoided her eyes. Jae-wook, what happened last night? He was quiet for so long that Isabella thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. There are aspects of my business that I haven't told you about, he said. Things that could put you in danger just by association. Isabella's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. What kind of things? Jae-wook met her eyes finally, and she saw resignation there, as if he'd made a decision he'd been avoiding. My family has been involved in alternative business ventures for 3 generations. Import-export is legitimate, but it's not our only source of income. The careful euphemism hung in the air between them, and Isabella felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The deference of his employees, The expensive security, the way he'd handled Vincent's treatment of her with such swift efficiency. "You're talking about organized crime," she said quietly. "I'm talking about protecting my family's interests and the people who depend on us," Jae-wook corrected, but he didn't deny her assessment. "Last night, a rival organization made threats against our territory. It's been handled, but what? But they know about you now, about how much you mean to Taemin and to me." His hands clenched into fists on the table. "I've put you in danger by letting you get close to us." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the early morning air. What kind of danger? Before Jae-wook could answer, his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and his expression grew grim. "Marcus," he answered. "What is it?" Isabella watched his face grow paler as he listened to whatever Marcus was telling him. When he hung up, his hands were shaking slightly. "What's wrong?" Isabella demanded. "They took your grandmother," Jae-wook said, his voice hollow. "The Tanaka clan. They have Dorothy." The world tilted around Isabella. No, that's not possible. She was safe at home. She doesn't have anything to do with this." "They're using her as leverage," Jae-wook interrupted, his own anguish evident despite his attempt to remain calm. "They want me to withdraw from certain territories, and they're using Dorothy to ensure my compliance." Isabella was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. "We have to call the police. We have to—" "The police can't help with this," Jae-wook said gently, catching her hands in his. "But I can. I will get her back, Isabella. I promise you that." "How? And don't tell me you can't explain, because my grandmother's life is at stake." Jae-wook was quiet for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Because I have resources the police don't. Because I know how these people think, how they operate. And because I would burn down half of Portland before I let anything happen to the people I love." The intensity in his voice, the raw emotion he was no longer trying to hide, made Isabella's breath catch. "The people you love?" "Yes," he said simply. "You and Taemin. You're my family now, whether I planned it or not." Isabella felt tears threatening, but she pushed them back. Dorothy needed her to be strong now. "Tell me what we're going to do." "We?" Jae-wook shook his head. "You're going to stay here with Taemin where it's safe. I'm going to handle this." "Like hell I am," Isabella said fiercely. "That's my grandmother they have. I'm not sitting on the sidelines while you play some kind of dangerous game with her life." "Isabella, you don't understand how dangerous these people are." "Then explain it to me," she snapped. "Stop trying to protect me from the truth and tell me what we're dealing with." Jae-wook studied her face for a long moment, and Isabella saw the exact moment he recognized that she wasn't going to back down. "The Tanaka clan runs most of the illegal gambling and drug trade on the west side of the city," he said finally. "They've been trying to expand into our territory for months, and last night we sent a message that we wouldn't tolerate their encroachment." "What kind of message?" "The kind that involves their lieutenant spending the night in the hospital," Jae-wook admitted. "Taking Dorothy is their response. They're betting that I care more about your family than I do about maintaining territory." "And do you?" Isabella asked quietly. "Yes," he said without hesitation, "which is why this is going to end today." Over the next hour, Isabella watched Jae-wook transform from the man she'd been falling in love with into someone she barely recognized. He made phone calls in rapid Korean, his voice cold and authoritative. Men arrived at the house, dangerous-looking men who treated Jae-wook with the kind of respect reserved for someone truly powerful. But it was when Marcus arrived with a detailed plan for retrieving Dorothy that Isabella truly understood what Jae-wook was capable of. "The warehouse where they're holding her has 4 entry points," Marcus explained, spreading blueprints across the dining room table. "We can have teams positioned at each one, but they'll be expecting that." "What about the service tunnels?" Jae-wook asked, pointing to something on the blueprint that Isabella couldn't see clearly. "Risky but possible. If we can get someone inside to create a distraction—" "I'll go," Isabella said suddenly. Both men turned to stare at her. "Absolutely not," Jae-wook said immediately. "They won't expect me," Isabella continued, ignoring his protest. "I'm not part of your organization. I'm just the granddaughter who wants to negotiate for her grandmother's release. It's too dangerous," Jae-wook said flatly. Everything about this situation is dangerous, Isabella shot back. But I'm not going to let my grandmother pay the price for my association with you. If there's a way I can help get her out safely, I'm going to do it. Marcus looked between them, then cleared his throat. Actually, boss, it's not a terrible idea. If she goes in through the front while we position teams at the other entry points— No, Jae-wook said, his voice carrying absolute authority. I won't risk her life. Isabella stood up, meeting his gaze directly. It's not your choice to make. Dorothy is my family, and I'm going to help save her whether you approve or not. For a moment the room was silent, except for the tension crackling between them. Then Jae-wook's shoulders sagged slightly, and Isabella saw defeat in his eyes. If we do this, he said quietly, you follow my instructions exactly. No heroics, no improvisation. You do exactly what I tell you to do. Agreed, Isabella said immediately. And if anything goes wrong, you get out. You don't try to save anyone, you don't look back. You run. Isabella hesitated, then nodded. Okay. But even as she agreed, Isabella knew she was lying. If it came down to choosing between her own safety and Dorothy's life, there was no choice at all. What she didn't know was that Jae-wook knew she was lying too, and that he'd already made arrangements to ensure that no matter what happened at that warehouse, Isabella Martinez would walk away safely, even if it cost him everything. 2 hours later, as Isabella prepared to walk into the most dangerous situation of her life, she realized that somewhere between that rainy night 3 weeks ago and this moment, she'd fallen completely in love with a man whose world was built on violence and loyalty in equal measure, and she was about to discover just how far love could push someone when everything they cared about was on the line. Years later. Isabella Martinez Kim stood at the kitchen window of their Portland home, watching her husband teach their daughter the proper way to tend the herb garden Dorothy had started before her passing. At 8 years old, little Sophia had inherited her father's intensity and her mother's compassion, along with an alarming tendency to try to rescue every stray animal in the neighborhood. Ioma, look, Taemin called from the garden, now 15 and taller than Isabella. Sophia actually listened to Appa about the basil. Isabella smiled, remembering the scared 6-year-old who had cried in the rain that night so many years ago. Taemin had grown into a thoughtful teenager who spoke 3 languages fluently and had recently announced his intention to study medicine, much to his father's pride and slight bewilderment. She risked her job to shelter a crying boy. Isabella murmured to herself, thinking of the title that had started it all, not knowing he was the Korean Mafia boss's son. Talking to yourself again? Jae-wook's voice came from behind her, warm with affection. Isabella leaned back against his chest as his arms wrapped around her waist. Just remembering that night. How different our lives might have been if I'd listened to Vincent and stayed inside. Vincent who? Jae-wook asked innocently, though they both knew the former cafe manager had relocated to a different state shortly after his business mysteriously failed. You know exactly who, Isabella laughed, turning in his arms. My dangerous, protective husband who definitely didn't have anything to do with certain people's career changes. Jae-wook's expression was the picture of innocence. I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm a legitimate businessman now, remember? It was true. In the years since Dorothy's rescue, which had ended with the Tanaka clan's complete withdrawal from Portland and several key members deciding to pursue opportunities in other cities, Jae-wook had gradually transitioned his organization toward entirely legal enterprises. The import-export business had expanded internationally, and Kim Industries now employed over 200 people in legitimate jobs. Mostly legitimate, Isabella corrected. Knowing there were still aspects of his business that operated in gray areas she preferred not to examine too closely. Completely legitimate, Jae-wook insisted, then grinned. With excellent security consulting services. Through the window, they watched Sophia abandon the garden to chase a butterfly, while Taemin patiently replanted the basil she'd accidentally uprooted in her enthusiasm. Do you ever regret it? Jae-wook asked quietly. The danger, the complications, everything that came with loving us? Isabella considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked it. Their life together hadn't been simple. There had been threats to navigate, cultural differences to bridge, and the ongoing challenge of raising children who understood that their family was different from others. But there had also been love, fierce, protective, unconditional love that had transformed all of them. Jae-wook had learned to trust again, to open his heart to the possibility of happiness. Tae-min had gained not just a stepmother, but a little sister who adored him, and a sense of security he'd lost when his birth mother died. And Isabella had discovered that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the most necessary one. "Never," she said firmly, rising on her toes to kiss him. Not for a single moment. Even when Sophia tried to adopt that raccoon family. Even then. Isabella laughed. "Though I draw the line at wild animals in the house. What about wild husbands?" Jae-wook asked, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Those I can handle," Isabella replied, pulling him down for another kiss. Outside, Sophia's delighted laughter mixed with Tae-min's patient instructions, and Isabella felt the same sense of contentment that had filled her every day since that stormy night, when she'd chosen compassion over caution. She'd risked her job to shelter a crying boy, never knowing he was the Korean Mafia boss's son. But more than that, she'd risked her heart on a love that had seemed impossible, and found a family that was worth every moment of danger they'd faced together. And as Jae-wook whispered "I love you" in Korean against her ear, Isabella knew that some risks were always worth taking, especially the ones that led you home.